Iran. Jeg har i hvert fall nevnt det mange ganger. Og det henger jo sammen med ditt spørsmål også. Hva skal til for at norske myndigheter skal forstå at Iran ikke er en rettsstat og ikke henviser til iranske lover? Jeg tror det er veldig viktig med dokumentasjon. Altså, alle vet jo at det foregår menneskerettighetsbrudd i Iran. Alle vet jo veldig mye. Men når du spør dem kan du bevise det, så er det veldig vanskelig å dokumentere. Og der er vårt problem. Det er derfor vi jobber veldig hardt for å finne dokumentasjon. Og da vil jeg tro at norske myndigheter vil også høre på. Men det er vanskelig. Vi lever i en vanskelig verden hvor vi må dokumentere. Selvfølgelig, det er jo problematisk at hvis vi tenker at en god del asyl, altså det er jo en del asylsøkere, noen kanskje ikke har rett på asyl, og som søker om det, og så er det en god del som har rett på asyl, men ikke klarer å bevise. Og det er et dilemma. Jeg mener at sivilen skal komme dit til gode, men nå er det ikke jeg som representerer norske myndigheter her. Går det kort?
بکنم هر سوال از من پرسیدن که هر کدوم از این سوالا خودش نیاز داره که یه سمینار جداگونه‌ای ولی چون نواس این سمینار رو برگزار کرده من در رابطه با پناهنده‌ها شروع می‌کنم بعد میرسم به سوالا.
Siden NOAS har arrangert dette seminaret, så da tar jeg snakker om asylsøkere, og så går vi videre.
ببینید ما این وضعیتی که در حال حاضر در اینجا توضیح دادیم همچنین آقای امیری مقدم خیلی واضح هستش مشخصه که در ایران
grandfather and listening very much and you believe that now you are really on the way into a real dialogue. But when he finally responds, you feel it's not a real dialogue. It goes very much back in history. The occupations and humiliations of people in this region. And he has some good points, no doubt about that. And the relations to Israel is always the main point. And in his view, the West and the US is the same thing. I try to explain it's not always. And I explained to him, for instance, with regard to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Norway took another standpoint than US and UK. Now, that was to some interest for him, but nevertheless, to sum it up, the US is the same as the West. Israel is the main problem, and in history, occupations and humiliations is a background for our behavior. We had, to some extent, a discussion, but not so easy to have a real dialogue. Ahmadinejad is very different in his behavior. He's very spontaneous. He loves discussions, and especially if there are media present. And he's interrupting very often and so on. Very different person to Ali Khamenei, but the message is the same. His master's voice. And the master is Ali Khamenei, of course. Israel and occupation and humiliation and the West is our main enemy and so on. And that is their excuse for everything. When we talked about, and I raised the questions of human rights in Iran, you can be sure I did. And I discussed with them the role of Iran in the region, and how they, if they change, can play a constructive role, a very important role. But all the time they come back to these issues I mentioned, US, Israel, occupation. That is their excuse for everything, and for not implementing any reforms. And I try to say to them, yeah, well, you can mean that Israel is a big problem, US is a big problem, history is a big problem. That cannot be an excuse for doing nothing today. But it is. And then you can understand dialogue is not easy. That's some of my experience. Don't know yet. He mentioned especially Turkey as a possible role model, both for the Arab country in the Mediterranean region and for Iran in future we can hope for. And we heard Tor Kinsarvik from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs explaining the official Norwegian policy towards Iran with regard to sanctions and with regard to possible engagement. He was not too optimistic in that regard. I'll come back to. Now in the second session we have had very clear documentation of the very serious human rights situation in Iran on different fields. This is in a way the background for my intervention. Allow me first to go back before the election 2009, because this has given me some experience with regard to dialogue with high-ranking people from Iran. Back in 2007, we established a cooperation between the Oslo Center and the Foundation of Dialogue Among Civilizations, led by former Iranian President Mohammad Khatami. It was Khatami who contacted us, and he was establishing his own foundation in Tehran and in Geneva, and we established the Oslo Center here. We met when we both were in office in Geneva. Now I think it's 8-9 years ago, on a conference organized by the World Council of Churches. And then we had the joke saying that there were two countries in the world led by clergymen, and that was Iran and Norway. And that was true, but we did it in a different way. But it was interesting because we were both clergymen and both politicians, so we understood each other rather well, because we knew both the political and religious language. And talking with Iranians, that is a great advantage, because Iran is a religious state. Norway is not in the same way as you know. We are changing the relations between church and state, and we are also changing paragraph 2 in our constitution. The goal of our cooperation was to try to contribute to increase the understanding between the Islamic world and the Western world through a dialogue. And we wanted to talk to each other in an open, frank atmosphere. And it gave us, from the Oslo Center, at the same time, also an opportunity to approach important people of Iran, both in the political and civil society, working for reforms and for human rights. We wanted, through the events that we organized, 5 of them in our cooperation, to getting come together, not only religious leaders, but also political leaders and people from the academic environment. And that worked very well. We started with a conference here in Oslo in May 2007, which was a kickoff for our cooperation, followed by 3 different workshops, one in Geneva, one in Tehran, one in Oslo, about extremism and tolerance, about politics and religion, and about gender and equality. Even gender and equality we discussed with also religious leaders from Iran. And we had a wrap-up, a summing up conference in Tehran in October 2008. And we made, that was also interesting, common statements from all these 5 events, and you can find them on the website of the Oslo Center, where we tried to sum up what did we agree upon within these different topics. And also we indicated what we disagreed upon. And the goal for a dialogue, in my view, is 1, to identify common values and how can we use them to mobilize for reconciliation and peace, and also identify areas of disagreements. And the goal is how can we live peacefully with our disagreements. And we did both during this dialogue. In my view, it was fruitful, and we also tried to bring this message out to the international community, and especially the Summing Up conference in Tehran had a broad coverage from media, bringing out the message to the world community in order to increase the understanding and respect for each other in the Western and in the Islamic world, in order to decrease tensions and hopefully contribute to a better understanding and dialogue. So
jeg skulle si noen annet som forskjellig av dere som påpeker. Iran en flerkulturelt samfunn. Det 6 nasjoner eller etniske grupper lever eller bor i Iran. Det pashtune, tyrkere, kurdere, belutsjer og arabere og tyrkere. 12 millioner kurdere fra første dagen som iranske stater skulle stifte revyene, sa nei til urettferdighet mot folk. Og i løpet av 33 år iranske kurdere, det ca. 50 000 sivile mennesker mistet livet, og 56 000 av kurdiske aktiviteter også mistet livet. Jeg vil påpeke litt mer om mange fengsler full av kurdere. Jeg vil si noe om diskriminering av iranske staten på en andre måte. En som kurder, når går på fengsel, det mye forskjell med de andre som ikke kurder. Og belutsjene samme. Men jeg sier et eksempel. Muhammad Sadiq som dannet i iranske kurdistanske menneskelighet. Han ikke fått enda tillatelse for å gå på fri og treffe familien. Men de mange andre iranske aktiviteter har ofte fått fri. Spørsmålet at det iranske staten diskriminerer så mye. Men hvorfor vi som aktiv i mange humanitære organisasjoner, menneskerettighetsorganisasjoner, hvorfor vi diskriminerer? Jeg ser så like opp mange kurdiske aktiviteter som ofte henges, som på fengsel, som torturet. Men hvis vi skal ikke være sammen, kurdere, belutsjene og andre, aldri vi kan kaste den totalitære regimet. Derfor jeg ønsker de organisasjonene som jeg påpeker, humanitære andre, ser nøye på saken på nytt og behandler saken på en rettferdig måte, arbeidsliv. Da på den måten vi kan gjøre mye. Ellers bare iranske stater utnytter det.
The question was about the situation mainly for the Kurds, so please, if you would both like to comment on it.
Kan jeg si, jeg følte meg truffet, kan jeg si noe?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's a good question, and I agree with you that situation of the human rights among... Ja, skal jeg snakke på norsk? Ja, ok. Jeg helt enig med deg at menneskerettighetssituasjonen blant minoriteter i Iran langt verre enn ellers. Nå det vel slik at dette faktisk noe vi skriver om. Vi sendte nå nylig en rapport til FNs spesialrapportør og nevnte spesielt 3 politiske fanger som eksempel, og alle 3 var kurdere. Vi snakket om Harullah Latifi, som dømt i døden. Fordi om den saken hadde vi mye informasjon. Vi snakket om Muhammad Sadiq, hans situasjon i fengsel, og og hvis du ser på våre websider, vi skriver, så når det oppstår en situasjon, så skriver vi om det. Men vi har et problem, for eksempel når det gjelder Baluchistan. Der det jo veldig vanskelig med informasjon. Vi har, det jo helt riktig, du sier, de fleste av våre kilder i store byer og i Teheran. Og vi skriver i våre rapporter at Vi vet faktisk ikke hva som foregår i mange fengsler. Blant annet for eksempel i Balochistan. Vi skriver det vi kan, men vi har ikke nok informasjon. Så det er absolutt på ingen måte et forsøk på å diskriminere. Men det jeg tenker også er at det innlegget jeg holdt nå, vi snakket om Iran, og da tenker vi på hele Iran, men 25 minutter, og da kan du si hvorfor begynte jeg ikke med minoriteter? Det har du jo helt rett i. Det kan også være med manglende dokumentasjon. Altså. Men ikke forsøk på, absolutt ikke noe forsøk på diskriminering fra vår side.
Movement is a political movement, not only in Iran but also in all of the world. So when we are acting, it's political action. But the way of acting is important. Yes, for me to show our protest or to show our criticize against what's happening in Iran, and also, for example, to make some networking with women in, for example, Arab countries, to show our activities, to show our power, and to show what we want in other network, in other actions, is more political than to be a member of a political movement and to show that I am a political activist and I wanted to change something. So when I'm talking about this thing, I'm saying that if I wanted to make a democracy, you should act in the way that you are doing. When I'm talking about the women campaign, we are talking about the equal right. Equal right depends on equal thinking. You cannot say that I want equal legal situation, but you don't think that you can have equal acting or behavior. So I think that the method and also the targets should be together. So I think that we need to reorganize ourselves in a political action, maybe in in a huge area, but not to show that we are a part of an activity as a political. I don't know.
I just want to follow up on that with Bonnevik was describing the difficulties that Hatami and Moussaoui had of actually having a network and being part of a network and having international contacts. And you yourself, you have both left Iran and work from outside. How would you describe the possibility of just connecting the representatives of the women working within the Green Movement and the women who were active in the 1 in a 1 million? Is it possible? How is it possible? Can you say something about that?
I'm just saying my personal.
I don't think that word, I think it's out of battery. So
I think my voice is loud enough.
No, I think we should, yes, the microphone.
But I'm just saying my personal. I don't want to talk about the women's movement because this is various things happening in women's movement. But my personal view is that we can't separate women from the movement that's happening in society because they are part of any movement that's happening. When we talk about democracy, yes, women are fighting for democracy because if there is democratic government or regime, then they definitely respect women's rights and the rights of other groups. But I think yes, the women they are playing very important role to these political movements because they are half of the population of the country. They are active in public life, and now some of women activists or human rights defenders are living outside Iran. It doesn't mean that they are not working on the related issue. They are working. If they are students, they are studying. Sometimes they just choose relevant studies. For instance, some of my colleagues are working on women's rights and working on CEDAW, the convention. They are researching, they are to find a way to find a better solution that how Iranian government, because Iran hasn't ratified CEDAW yet, And they are doing research to see how Iran can ratify the convention, the Women's Convention, to bring equality and respect women. So I think this is not correct to say that diaspora, the people who are living outside Iran, they are disconnected totally with the people inside Iran, because I think they are working together. And they are the voice of those who cannot express themselves in Iran, but they are talking about them outside Iran.